My name is Jake Rankin, and I'm here to inform you about the National Basketball Association and its history. Now, before we get to the association itself, we need to start off with where the sport began. It began back in 1891 in the state of Kansas with Dr. James Naismith. He created the sport, and he had 13 simple rules at the beginning of the sport, and the very first game was played with peach baskets and a soccer ball. Now, the sport of basketball did not see the professional level until 1937. It had to get to the college level first and then on to the Olympics. The very first Olympics game that had basketball was 1936. So the year right after, in 1937, is when the very first professional league began. That was the National Basketball League. And in about 1948-49, it combined with the Basketball Association of America. And when those two combined, that's when it became what we know as today the National Basketball Association, the NBA. Now, the professional level had the NBL, the National Basketball League. However, the closest form to what we know today as the NBA came when the BAA, the Basketball Association of America, was formed. Now, they were formed a little bit later, a few years after the NBL. They formed after World War II. A bunch of businessmen got together and created this idea of the BAA after World War II had settled down and people went back to their normal lives. They came from cities like Boston, New York, Chicago, all the big eastern cities. Nothing west yet. West came later, but they came together and they formed the BAA, which consisted of 11 teams playing 60-game seasons. It didn't work for many reasons. One of the major reasons was the NBL, but it also was a major issue with the collegiate level being as popular as it was, playing back-to-back schedules, double headers, 40-minute games, took up a lot of TV time and it took up just a lot of viewership. So the BAA had a lot of obstacles to overcome. One of these big issues for the BAA was a man by the name of George Mikan. He was the best player in the world at that time and he was playing in the NBL. However, he came over to the BAA and was able to form the Los Angeles Lakers and became the first West Coast basketball team, really expanding the sport from coast to coast. In 1948, the NBL, after losing Mikan, kind of fizzled out and they took their best players and merged them with the BAA, creating the National Basketball Association, the NBA. Now, before this merger, the BAA was hurting. They only had 7 teams left playing 48-game seasons. After the merger, they were finally up to 17 teams and had 60-game seasons once more. Their issue, though, was still the collegiate level. The college level was still getting a lot of viewership, and they got their biggest break when point shaving became a huge scandal in college sports, really taking away from the viewership and harsh punishments coming down on those teams. It created a slot opening that the NBA filled and was able to finally gain success in the sport of basketball. Now, up until this point, up until 1967, there was really not much that happened to the NBA. Wilt Chamberlain scored his 100 points, and a guy by the name of Chuck Cooper became the first African-American player. Other than that, though, not much had happened until 1967 when the ABA was formed, the American Basketball Association. They brought a new dynamic to the game and offered real competition to the NBA. Their dynamic was bringing in dunk contests, all-star games, the three-point contest, alley-oops, three-point line. So they brought all these new chemicals to the game that really were dangerous for the NBA. However, because the NBA had been around for so long, the ABA just was not structured enough to withstand the power of the NBA and soon fizzled down to only about 4 or 5 teams. Those teams, which included the Spurs and the Nets, merged with the NBA, and that's where we get players like George Gervin and Julius Erving. So it expanded the game and was honestly actually good for the NBA, even though it was a little worrisome at first. As we neared the 80s, the 1980s, the NBA had become much more diverse. The beginning stages were a bunch of Caucasian males playing the game with a few standout African Americans. By the time the 1980s came around, it was predominantly African American, but had seen its fair share of different diverse cultures throughout its time since it had started in the 1940s. Viewership, however, had gone down in the 80s. There was bad TV contracts, and there was many reasons why viewership had gone down. There was a lot of blackouts when it came to the TV schedule, so there was issues and a real concern that the NBA would not survive the 80s. However, two predominant figures came out of that time period. They were both drafted in 1979. Magic Johnson was the first pick overall, Larry Bird was the sixth pick overall. And both of these men, who had a great friendship but also a great rivalry on the court, carried that rivalry from college into the NBA. And all of a sudden, there was a new excitement about the game. People wanted to go see these two continue their battles. And if you look at every championship won throughout the 80s, it goes back and forth between the Celtics and the Lakers, just back and forth, back and forth. There was a few other championships winners during that time period, but for the most part, it was who was going to win, the Lakers or the Celtics. And they always played each other in the finals, so people were finally interested again. They enjoyed the rivalry. They liked that these guys were friends as well. So it was a whole new aspect of the game and really saved the game. Another player to enter the league in the 80s was Michael Jordan, and he became a great success early on. Everyone loved him. And along with Larry and Magic and the commissioner at the time, David Stern, he helped get the NBA out of the 80s and really usher in a new era. He began the Jordan brand, which is still extremely famous today. He actually makes more money off of that than he does from his playing career, and he has paved a path for players to begin to brand themselves outside of basketball, even all the way up to today. He also was so successful on the court that people are trying to emulate that and become the best of all time and beat Jordan, such as LeBron and Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant is the closest thing we had ever seen to Michael after Michael. So these two players, along with many others, are trying to be the next Michael Jordan and create a brand like his. So Michael became the biggest star the sport had ever seen and also created the super team mentality, and we see many super teams today in the NBA. In the NBA today, we see super contracts being formed as well as super teams. The super contracts come from mega TV deals that are being signed throughout the league with different cable companies, and the super teams are being formed to stay competitive and try to win and combat the other super teams that are being formed. Also, with social media, players have a brand new platform to voice their opinion, and we are seeing new dynamics to the players today, taking on social issues rather than just playing the game and dribbling a basketball.